Welcome to our, I think it's our final research seminar of the year actually for Parks, which I'm sure you'll all be very sad to hear about, but we've got a really good one to finish on. So today we're going to be hearing from Faith Hillis about a really exciting new book, Utopia's Discontents, Russian Émigrés and the Quest for Freedom, 1830s to 1930s. So just to say a little bit about Faith Hillis, she's an Associate Professor of History at the University of Chicago. We're very grateful for her to join us today. She's written previously on Russian nationalism and also Russian and Ukrainian identity, writing a really great book, actually. I think it's published back in 2013 or 14. I might be wrong. Children of Rus, Right Bank, Ukraine and the Invention of the Russian Nation. And her second monograph has really gone into a very kind of different, but extremely interesting direction, looking really at transnational history. So this is a really exciting new book, looking really at, I suppose, you can hear a lot more about it, but Russian émigré kind of communities and kind of revolutionary kind of social experimentation in kind of major cities and kind of like fin de siècle Europe, but contextualizing it more broadly, going back into the 1830s, well into the 1930s. So I'm going to hand over to Faith. Thank you all very much for joining us. And it's great to see, in the spirit of the book, a really transnational audience tuning in from all different parts of the world, as well as Southampton and Winchester, close to home. All right. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us, Faith. Really looking forward to hearing from you today. And we're really looking forward to some good audience engagement following. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Good evening to people in the UK and in France. Good afternoon, good morning to those in the US. It's high noon in Chicago. So it will never cease being surreal giving these book talks from my kitchen, but I'm very happy to be here with all of you. And as was said, it's wonderful to be able to connect with people from all over the world. I'm going to begin screen sharing now. I'm going to put this into slideshow. Okay, hopefully someone will alert me if there's any problems with sound or visuals as we go. All right, so I'm going to talk about the book, which is now available in the UK and as an in the US and as an ebook, and it will be released in the UK next month. Oops. Okay. The future of humanity once depended on this brasserie in Geneva. Or so it seemed, at least, to the young people from Russia who frequented the Café Landau in the summer of 1903. In a back room, Vladimir Lenin gathered with comrades to build a new Marxist party. And up front, Chaim Weizmann, the future first president of Israel, met with friends to lay plans for a Zionist university that would cultivate the national potential of the Jewish people. The Landau stood at the very heart of Geneva's so-called Russian colony, a boisterous community of exiles that included professional revolutionaries representing every leftist party from the Russian Empire, as well as nationalists of every stripe. So there were not only Zionists, but also Poles, Armenians, Ukrainians, and others representing their own national projects. Russian colonies in Geneva and in other European cities sheltered several generations of activists and produced most of the illegal literature that circulated in Russia. These were sites where Russians discovered socialism, anarchism, and Marxism, and where Bolshevism was born. But the utter dominance of a very traditional brand of intellectual history in approaching these communities means that we actually know very little about the lives of these colonies as places and spaces. Why did Lenin, a Russian Marxist from the Volga River, and Weizmann, a Jewish nationalist from Belarus, end up in the same cafe thousands of miles from their respective homes? What were the results of the encounters that occurred at the Café Landau and other places like it? These are the central questions of the book, which produces the first synthetic account of radical exile life over the last 50 years of the Tsarist regime. I argue that these Russian colonies should be seen as utopian communities whose improvised nature allowed residents to build the world that they wanted to see. Now, I want to emphasize from the beginning that when I'm speaking about their utopian quality, I'm not suggesting that the goal of utopia is quixotic or impossible. And in fact, quite the contrary, following the Marxist theorist Ernst Bloch, I'm interested in thinking through how the dream of a perfect world becomes inscribed in praxis and expressed in the lives of these living, breathing communities. I show how colony life afforded émigrés the opportunity to liberate themselves from the bonds that had oppressed them in Russia and to evolve from merely dreaming about the revolution to actually living a revolution. And it turns out that through living revolutionary lifestyles and creating these new revolutionary communities abroad, émigrés actually managed to prefigure the better world of which they dreamed, to bring it to life. So this is an argument that's trying to broaden the purview of intellectual history, thinking about lived experience, everyday life, as a vital part of intellectual production. It's also one that I'm hoping, and perhaps for the particular interest of some who come to this talk today, will help to recast the history of Jews in late Imperial Russia, showing how the Jewish struggle for freedom abroad, in fact, came to underpin many of these Russian revolutionary dreams. This project is very much about specific spaces and places. I'm going to argue that the peculiar demographics of these colonies, their spatial arrangement, and the contacts that they catalyzed all define their revolutionary potential. But at the same time, the forms of radical praxis that emerged from these communities ultimately traveled far beyond their borders. I'll show how the experiments born in the colonies made it back to Russia, and I'll identify several junctures at which developments abroad actually played a crucial role in forging radical thought throughout the country that the émigrés had left behind. In addition to providing this properly transnational account of the Russian revolutionary movement, this book yields new insights into the entanglements between autocratic Russia and liberal Europe. And as we'll see, the colonies left some surprising marks on their host societies. Above all, this book argues for the generative power of the immigrant milieu, but it also shows how the revolutionary visions articulated in the colonies evolved in unexpected and sometimes troubling ways. Ultimately, the colonies produced deep discontents that would shape revolutionary culture no less profoundly than their utopian dreams and lifestyles. So I'm going to start by discussing what it meant for colony residents to live the revolution and how they did so. I'm then going to turn to consider the influence of these émigrés in shaping politics across borders. And I'm going to close by thinking about the unanticipated results of the utopian experiments that occurred abroad and how they influenced the Russian Revolution. All right. Space and demography, as I've already suggested, both played key roles in defining the utopian potential of the Russian colonies. And I spent a great deal of time trying to understand how this worked, and I found digital techniques actually quite helpful in this enterprise. We have very little reliable population data about who lived in the colonies and when and where, actually, given that most of the people who leave Russia leave so illegally, and they're also not systematically tracked upon their arrival in Europe. And one of the most effective ways that I found to sort of gauge and estimate their evolution over time and space is by looking at their literary output, which I should add was immense, and I'll talk a little bit about this later. As you'll see from this visualization of publications produced in the languages of the Russian Empire abroad, by the early 20th century, there were Russian colonies in almost every country in Europe. But by far the most significant centers were in the liberal powers of France, England, and Switzerland, and these served as my central archival case studies. Russian citizens flocked to these countries because they provided the most extensive political rights. Almost all czarist subjects, regardless of the reason they had come to these countries in the 19th century, were recognized as refugees and accorded the rights attached to that designation. Émigré settlements tended to emerge on the urban periphery, in inexpensive neighborhoods. Paris's Russian colony coalesced in the 13th arrondissement around what is now Les Gobelins. In Geneva, we're talking about the southern edge of the city leading up to the suburb of Carouge. And in London, Russians initially clustered around the British Library, a perennial favorite hangout of revolutionaries from the world over. Groups that had been particularly disadvantaged in Russia disproportionately flocked to the colonies. And they used the freedom of these spaces to liberate themselves abroad. These communities were run by professional revolutionaries who served as their moral consciences of sort. They were full as well of self-professed emancipated women who pursued university study abroad. And many of these women actually became radicalized when they were overseas, became involved in these illegal parties. So their sort of feminist enterprise becomes itself a sort of bridge to revolutionary activity. And then finally, these colonies were what I would call majority minority. That is, they were disproportionately populated by Poles, by Ukrainians, by Georgians, Armenians, and Jews. So when I'm using the term Russian to describe these spaces as their residents themselves did, I want to make clear that I'm referring to people from and of the Russian Empire, not as ethnically Russian. So all of these groups, revolutionaries, women, and national minorities, used the freedom of the colonies to pursue political programs abroad. These became sites of intense political organizing and agitation. But what was most interesting to me as I did this research was the way in which the social infrastructure of these neighborhoods not only articulated, but actually realized their values. Colony residents built a dense network of communes, revolutionary courts, mechanisms to redistribute wealth, self-governance institutions built around principles of justice and equity. They also created networks of clubs, coffee houses, libraries, canteens, and a lively periodical press. You'll see here just some of these spaces I've been able to locate in the archives in Paris and pull out, and we can talk about the digital supplement I've created for this book, but it's sort of trying to map these spaces all over the colonies where they exist, all over the continent where they exist. These institutions, which served all colony residents, catalyzed new encounters between men and women from different walks of life. They encouraged residents to build new solidarities and to contemplate the ways in which their individual aspirations were connected. For example, national minorities tended not only to seek freedom for their own people, but together they began to explore radical alternatives to imperial rule. So federalist ideas, federalist principles, the question of how all these national minorities could cooperate became a real focus of political discussion in these communities. Similarly, the project promoted by these emancipated women was not, in general, a narrow program of women's equal rights. Instead, it was a program that aimed to revolutionize the social order through the practice of free love and by smashing barriers between the classes and the sexes. The overarching ethos of these new solidarities and friendships was to give voice to the persecuted and dispossessed and to create a new society that recognized these values. So to look at the dynamics of how all of this works, I went to focus on an emancipatory campaign that I saw as I did my research as the most generative of all in these spaces, and that is the campaign for Jewish liberation. Some 60 to 80% of colony residents were Jews by birth, and this is precisely because Jews faced such intense repression in Russia. Resolving the so-called Jewish question became one of the most urgent preoccupations of colony life, and my account really places this problem at the very center of Russian revolutionary history. But of course, from the beginning, there was a great deal of disagreement about how to accomplish this goal of Jewish liberation. Some residents of Jewish origin gravitated to Marxism. They included Pavel Axelrod and Rosa Luxemburg, of course, both early and influential Marxist theorists. Stringent universalists, these two and other Marxists, insisted that the liberation of any specific group necessarily ran by way of general social revolution. As Axelrod put it, quote, "There is no Jewish question, only the social question," end quote. Zionism, which tended to see particularism instead of universalism as the solution to the Jewish question, also flourished in the hothouse of the colonies. Zionists waged fierce debates with Marxists abroad, and one at which speakers competed for the loyalty of students in Bern, a city with a great many Jewish students. This debate between Zionists and Marxists stretched over some 60 nights. But amidst this history of enmity and competition also lurks one of interconnection and influence. And in fact, several major Zionists who were not Marxists, including Weizmann and Vladimir Jabotinsky, talk about how it was precisely their encounters with Jewish Marxists in the close quarters of these colonies that helped to consolidate their nationalist Zionist convictions. So I'm arguing here that these oppositional ideologies, when meeting in these small spaces, in fact become mutually constitutive. Encounters that occurred in the colonies also played a crucial role in shaping a third political alternative that moved between Zionism and Marxism. And this is one that I might call Jewish socialism. This path was pioneered by a now obscure figure named Aaron Lieberman. A former rabbinical student, Lieberman fell in with a group that revolved around the Russian socialist Pyotr Lavrov, who had moved to London in the 1870s. You see this group pictured here. Lieberman challenged the long history of anti-Semitism in Russian radicalism, urging Russian socialists to engage more with Jewish issues and to recruit more Jews into their movement. Indeed, he argued that Jews were the most oppressed people of empire, oppressed by virtue of their religion, their ethnicity, and their class status as proletarians for the most part. He contended that they were therefore Russia's ideal revolutionaries. As these debates continued between Jewish intellectuals, a new wave of migration began that transformed the nature of these arguments. And here I come back to this importance of lived experience and encounters. In the 1880s, Jewish proletarians began to flee Russia en masse. In contrast to the residents of the colonies, most of these travelers were not intellectuals with university educations, but instead they were traditional Yiddish-speaking Jews from the Pale of Settlement. Most would not have even really identified as Russian or with Russia had you asked them, but rather they would have engaged more with their region, identified with their region of origin. Tens of thousands of these travelers settled in London and Paris, where most found work in artisanal trades and in sweatshops. And although these two cities already hosted large Russian colonies by this point, the newcomers tended not to gravitate to those communities. This is another sign of their sociological distinctiveness. Instead, they gravitated to neighborhoods with their own long Jewish histories, the East End in London and the Marais in Paris. Aaron Lieberman, who had already committed himself to engaging Jews in the revolutionary movement, immediately gravitated to these Jewish proletarians who were arriving by the boatload by the day in his adopted city of London. And his encounters with these newcomers encouraged his brand of Jewish socialism to evolve in new directions. He observed that Jewish workers who had suffered from poverty and persecution in Russia now faced new forms of exploitation at the hands of developed capitalism in the West. According to Lieberman, this experience of universal persecution across many different national contexts and economic contexts made Russian Jewish proletarians ideally suited to lead a truly global struggle for the emancipation of all people. Lieberman thus argued that the particular suffering of Jewish workers in the West could be harnessed in pursuit of the broader cause of the liberation of mankind. This insight into how the particular could in fact inform the universal encouraged Lieberman to use a new mobilizational tactic to conduct political agitation in Yiddish. And this was at this point a deeply unconventional move, since most of those radical intellectuals, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, viewed Yiddish as a jargon unbefitted to discussing high culture, politics, or other important matters. Lieberman succeeded in organizing the world's first Yiddish-speaking workers' union in London in the late 70s. And by the 80s, young Jewish intellectuals inspired by his work flooded into the East End, creating the world's first Yiddish radical newspapers, as well as a series of clubs and reading groups, the most famous of which was the Berners Street Club in East London, pictured here. These institutions carried on the task of translating the concerns of Russian revolutionaries to Jewish workers, and this happened on both a literal and a metaphorical level. Revolutionaries hired unemployed workers to translate the Russian revolutionary classics into Yiddish. Here's the literal element of translation. And on a more metaphorical level, radicals encouraged the immigrant workforce to see the revolutionary politics of the colonies as the solution to these workers' everyday travails. So here's an image from one of these very first Yiddish language newspapers in London that explains the importance of the Paris Commune to these sweatshop workers and essentially tells them why this revolutionary history matters to them. By the late 80s, these revolutionary organizing efforts yielded their first fruit. Yiddish-speaking labor unions in London staged their first successful strikes against employers. The revolutionary movement that had emerged in London was the product of encounters between professional revolutionaries and Jewish proletarians that defined class and linguistic boundaries. It harnessed the particular experience of Jews and their cultural traditions in the service of mankind via the liberation of labor. And word of these accomplishments, as well as these publications coming out of London, rapidly began to circulate around the world. London organizers were in close connection with activists in New York and in Paris, exporting their tactics and their publications. And going back here, this is the same data that I had before about publications, but here sorted by language. You'll see that Yiddish, here designated by yellow, becomes an important part of this Russian revolutionary literary production, particularly in London, where it's about 1/3 of all the things published by these immigrants. The rapprochement between Jewish proletarians and Russified intellectuals was extremely consequential for all segments of the emigration. Marxists, as well as non-Marxist parties, including socialist revolutionaries, anarchists, and others, began to move into these Jewish working class neighborhoods and to found their own Yiddish language newspapers, clubs, and so on. Here's a wonderful picture of a group of Yiddish-speaking anarchists that I found in the archives in Paris who were arrested. Gradually, proletarian Jews who had been so dispossessed in their homeland of Russia became vital participants in and even leaders of the Russian revolutionary movement abroad. I have astonishing archival examples of sweated workers in London and Paris appearing at mass meetings and proclaiming their willingness to return to Russia and die for the revolution. So in essence, I'm arguing here that these Jewish proletarians were in fact Russified, drawn into Russian revolutionary politics abroad. In the process, the nature of immigrant neighborhoods began to change. In London, the traditionally Jewish neighborhood of the East End became the new center for Russian radical life, drawing in Gentiles as well as Jews. For many, this development was the greatest sign yet of the promise of immigrants to overcome linguistic, ethnic, and class differences, and to join all men and women in common cause. Now, the politics that emerged from the colonies were intimately tied to their dense space and these unique encounters that I've already described. But they also had profound effects on the world beyond their borders. And I'm here transitioning into the second part of the talk. Although immigrant settlements were isolated and far-flung, the circulation of texts and peoples between them knitted them into a single communicative space. Libraries in different cities exchanged texts. Mutual aid organizations emerged that claimed to represent the interests of the immigration as a whole. Meanwhile, colony residents maintained connections with Russia through intricate smuggling networks, some of which I've been able to map here. These spirited tens of thousands of illegal publications into the empire every year, and tens of thousands of dissidents out, often through the same methods, just going in reverse. So in short, I'm arguing that colony residents were indeed imagining a world without borders, but they were also in some ways living it, breaking down these borders between states, people, and population. Already by the 70s and 80s, it's clear that these networks were having a profound effect on Russian radicalism. And I can talk about this more in the Q&A, but I've been able to connect this foreign organizing to the emergence of the populist movement in the 1870s, which is the first kind of all-imperial Russian revolutionary movement that we see. But of all of the movements created abroad, it was the unique brand of Yiddish socialism that emerged in the East End that had the most profound impact on Russia. In the 1890s, the city of Vilna gave rise to a new Yiddish socialist movement infused by a democratic spirit that eventually evolved into the Jewish Labor Bund, and this was one of the first organized Marxist parties in the Russian Empire. The foundation of the Bund is usually approached as a domestic story, but I argue that emigre publications and returned activists played a crucial role in this process. The Bund quickly became the largest party in Russia, and for a few years even served as the motive force of Russian Marxism. Indeed, in 1898, Bund activists played a catalytic role in the creation of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, the first all-imperial Marxist party. So I think once again here, we see the colony's knack for harnessing the particular in the service of the universal. We see how these cultures and practices that emerged out of this very specific émigré setting began to acquire a broader import, and how Jewish socialism that emerges abroad becomes a constitutive element of Russian Marxism. The colony's reputation for living the revolution also had profound effects on European host societies. Russian immigrants were participants in almost all of the 19th century freedom struggles in Europe. It is, of course, well known that Russians played influential roles in the creation of the international left and the formation of the Second International. But it's less well known that they also mingled with Irish, Persian, and Indian nationalists themselves living in European exile, who came to see Russians as heroes, as inspirations in the struggle of subaltern forces against exploitative imperial powers. And I'm able to trace in the book how each of these movements drew on the inspirations and the insights of Russian activists. Russians also played a crucial role in the struggle for women's rights across the continent. There were very strong connections between Russian émigrés and British suffragettes, who in fact appear to have gotten the idea of the hunger strike, which they used to such success, from Russians who had pioneered this tactic in Siberian labor camps. It's interesting that the international left, these early anti-colonial movements, and European feminists all paid very special attention to the accomplishment of Russian Jewish revolutionaries living abroad. This group, to many, symbolized the capacity of the most weak and disempowered populations to triumph over the powerful. And I think that this took on broader symbolic import for all of these different emancipatory movements. So these relationships between Russians abroad and foreigners engaged in their own quests for freedom added to the utopian enactment of the colonies. They enhanced the colonies' reputation as spaces in which the powerless had created new societies that operated on their own terms, and in which borders had dissolved and systems of oppression had been obliterated from below. However, the power of these lived utopias also proved very facile. For the very elements that imbued the colonies with their revolutionary promise also undermined their potential. The intimacy and the solidarity of colony life tended to breed devastating conflicts that often married personal and ideological jealousies. They also facilitated the work, these intimacies, of the Russian secret police, or Okhrana, who successfully infiltrated, I'm sorry, I'm missing a slide. The Okhrana, who successfully infiltrated these communities in the 1880s with a network of informants and double agents. In the late 80s, the Tsarist secret police abroad launched a new kind of attack against the immigration, one that aimed to defame their reputation in an effort to corrode the sympathy they enjoyed in Europe and the protection they had been granted as refugees. The Okhrana established a press agency that paid off newspaper editors to publish articles and embedded its own agents at prominent Western journalistic outlets. This is a 19th century fake news endeavor, it turns out. This press agency also produced dozens of articles and pamphlets of its own in Western languages aimed at Western audiences. And you see a few that I've been able to identify published here. Finally, police engaged in a series of provocations that were intended to produce panic about the supposed criminal intent of these émigrés. And they went so far as to organize actual bombings and assassinations in Europe that were not in fact organized by émigrés, but were police provocations. I can say more about this later as well. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories were a crucial part of this campaign against the immigration. For example, when Jack the Ripper began terrorizing East London in 1888, Okhrana publicists immediately insisted that the killer was a deranged Russian Jewish anarchist. It didn't help that the body of one of the victims of Jack the Ripper was found outside the Burner Street Club, which I already showed you, on a night that its Russian Jewish members had gathered for a mass meeting about the promise of socialism. These stories were then picked up by British sources and repeated over and over, and we began to see, I'm sorry, I'm missing several slides here. We began to see images of Jack the Ripper in the British press that are explicitly anti-Semitic, sort of portraying Jack the Ripper as a Russian Jew. So I'm suggesting that the Tsarist secret police cannily found a way to turn the colony's struggle for Jewish liberation into an Achilles heel. Police meddling, reinforced by effective lobbying and press interventions, had a consequential impact in transforming European perceptions of the immigration. I'm going to go and see if these missing slides exist anywhere. No, they don't. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. Okay. So I have a slide here that shows, that I wanted to show, it's a Swiss cartoon of refugees, Russian refugees, as sort of long-suffering dissidents. And this is the idea that had been very common prior to about 1890. But by 1890, we see a growing panic about Russians as terrorists. And I had a slide that I also wanted to show you from a French illustrated journal, essentially showing that Russians as bombers, blowing up this squalid apartment that they're living in. And with this image of Russians as terrorists also comes the image of Russians as parties to a Jewish plot to destroy Christian society in Russia and Europe. So again, we get this anti-Semitic imagery factoring in here as well. And major attacks on immigrant legal rights accompany this shift in depictions and in perceptions circa 1890. The new external pressures that immigrant society faced also intensified its internal discord. Unsurprisingly, the Jewish question emerged as the issue of greatest contention internally. The invention of Jewish socialism, which had harnessed the particular in the service of the universal, had transformed colony life. But it also led to a blowback from stringent universalists among the ranks of Marxists, who complained in essence that Russian Marxism abroad had become too Jewish. Many of the founding fathers of Russian Marxism accused the Bund of trying to hijack the Marxist movement to achieve their own selfish interests. And these accusations, which were on the one hand informed by these long histories of radical anti-Semitism that I've already discussed, were further intensified by very, very deep personal jealousies as a result of the Bund's meteoric rise. Georgy Plekhanov, considered the founding father of Russian Marxism, wrote, and this is an example, quoting here, that the Bund is a band of exploiters who abuse Russians. And Plekhanov goes on to insist, still quoting, the Russian Social Democratic Party should be Russian, i.e. not Jewish. Pavel Axelrod, himself Jewish by birth, warned his comrades, quoting again, to watch their pockets when dealing with the Jews of the Bund, internalizing the very anti-Semitic canards that undergirded the Okhrana's anti-Semitic propaganda. So bear in mind, all of these ad hominem attacks are actually coming from within the ranks of Marxists. So this just gives you a sense of the sort of tone and intensity. And you can imagine what the attacks of these Marxists on nationalists and Zionists and other non-Marxists looks like. These conflicts spread like wildfire in the close-knit colonies, destroying longtime relationships. And by the early 20th century, the combination of these deep internal rifts and the new external pressures that I've just discussed had taken a very heavy toll. Consequently, the mood in the colonies turned distinctly dystopian. Enter Lenin, who arrives in Europe in 1900, having recently completed a term of Siberian exile. As we now know, Lenin used his time abroad to embark on a wholesale renovation of Marxist theory, rejecting the Marxist orthodoxy that revolution would evolve out of social contradictions and insisting that the revolution would be incited and guided by the conspiratorial actions of proven cadres. This entire turn of events is usually analyzed from the vantage point of the history of ideas. But Bolshevism, like previous radical movements, was profoundly shaped by the peculiarities of the immigrant milieu. Lenin's new revolutionary doctrines responded to the specific challenges that the immigration faced at the turn of the century. He took universalist Marxism to new extremes, scathingly rejecting the discussion of the legitimacy of any discussion about the special needs of Jews or women. He also blamed the disorder in the colonies on the émigrés' tradition of freewheeling intimacy and their efforts to pursue emancipation from below. But even as he challenged these august immigrant traditions, he joined prior generations of colony residents in using the improvised space of exile to build a utopian community of his own. And indeed, I argue that it's impossible to separate the ideology of Bolshevism from lived experience, that again, they're mutually constitutive. The Bolsheviks withdrew from the general Geneva colony to form their own inner sanctum on the south side of the city, venturing into the center of Russian Geneva around the university only to conduct agitation. Lenin used this new Bolshevik community to create the disciplined cadres of which he dreamed. The culture of the Bolshevik subcolony was explicitly patriarchal. Lenin's followers described him as a wise and benevolent father who set the party's path and mediated its internal disputes. And in this image produced by the original Bolsheviks, I think it's not a mistake that Lenin looms literally twice as large as any of the rest of them. Patriarchy was also reflected in the gender relations of this Bolshevik community. Although the first cohort, as you can see, included several married couples, women assumed crucial but traditionally feminine roles in this Bolshevik subculture, managing correspondence, cooking at the Bolshevik canteen, things like this. This was a major retreat from the roles that women had assumed in the public politics of the Russian colonies. Finally, Bolshevik ideology was indelibly shaped by encounters with non-Bolshevik rivals that they encountered when they ventured into the center of Russian Geneva to conduct agitation. The Bolsheviks used their intimate knowledge of other immigrants to discredit them. Lenin, for example, repeatedly compiled a dossier on the deviant sexual practices of Geneva's Mensheviks. I assume that he's referring to homosexual activity here. And he used this information to court fellow immigrants to his side. He also used the painful Jewish question as an effective wedge. He smeared the Mensheviks, who by then had broken off from him, as a Jewish party, noting that all but one of the Central Committee parties had been born into Jewish families. And he likewise smeared the Bund as a party of self-interested petty traders. Lenin succeeded in transforming the culture of the colonies, but he left them more divided than ever before. His personal attacks and provocative denunciations produced utter chaos in these communities, leading to physical violence, as well as the dissolution of friendships and marriages. It was at this point, for example, that many Zionists who had always acted in immigration within this general Russian framework, debating in immigrant taverns, speaking at student mass meetings, they withdraw from the colonies and form their own exclusive networks. And many at this point in the early 20th century also go further afield, moving on to Palestine. There's still work to be done on how this European experience influenced Israeli history and the future of Zionism, but I think that this is a book for someone else to write. Rather than being chastened by these rifts, Lenin encouraged them, even within his own party. Not only in the lead up to the Bolshevik-Menshevik split, but quite consistently, he preached that schism was necessary to cleanse the party of undercommitted activists and to realize its true revolutionary potential. By early 1917, however, Lenin himself grudgingly admitted that his gamble appeared to have come to naught. In a speech in Zurich, he admitted that his dreams of catalyzing worldwide revolution had failed. This is January 1917. His generation, he acknowledged at this point, would not live to see the revolution, and he only hoped that the Russian youth living in Zurich might. Weeks later, to Lenin's surprise more than anyone's, the revolution toppled the Tsarist regime. Bolsheviks immediately scrambled to return home, along with all of their rivals, including Bundists, Mensheviks, Socialist Revolutionaries, anarchists, and so on. So when Lenin arrives in Petrograd in April 1917, he takes his first step on Russian soil in 12 years. He's not been back since 1905. But in fact, many other emigres, including Plekhanov and the anarchist Kropotkin, had been away much, much longer. They had left Russia in the late 1870s. The final chapters of the book ask what happens when we view 1917 and the early Soviet period not only as a new beginning, but as the final chapter of this emigre saga. I've argued that emigre politics were improvisational and experiential. They were defined by the dynamics of peculiar spaces and places in which they took shape. For this reason, most one-time exiles were completely unmoored by the new environment that they found in Russia. The newborn mass politics of this huge country in turmoil looked completely unlike anything they had ever seen abroad. Lenin, however, barely missed a beat, very quickly adapting to the needs of his new milieu and reframing his platforms accordingly. And I think that it was his ability to craft ideological programs attuned to his surroundings, something that I think he learned in immigration, that was the single most important factor in his victory. In the spring of 1917, Lenin effectively embraced the entire legacy of utopian experimentation that had unfolded abroad. And this included programs that he had vehemently denounced in immigration, such as the struggle for Jewish liberation and women's liberation, which ironically became sort of trademarks, some of the most famous Bolshevik programs. He also takes models of revolution from the ground up that had been promoted by anarchists and SRs that become integral to his program, but he had vehemently argued against abroad. So I argue that Lenin's importation of this situational politics in immigrant communities helped him to triumph over his non-Bolshevik rivals. And I look at how the close bonds formed by elite Bolsheviks overseas helped as they struggled to consolidate a new state. However, as much as the Bolsheviks used their immigrant experience to their advantage, the discontents imported from exile also played important roles in the party's development. Lenin's brutal treatment of the Mensheviks and the Bund, I think, can only be understood by situating it in this broader context of long and tortured personal histories between the leaders of these parties. And I think, moreover, this explosive history of the Jewish question abroad helps to explain why Bolshevik discourse on this issue remains so tortured. Brendan McGeever and Andrew Sloan, among others, have recently shown how racialized tropes of Jewish perfidy remained a feature of Bolshevik political culture, even as the party ostensibly pursued Jewish liberation, and how both of these things were true at once. The final unintended side effect of immigrant history is the role that it played in the conflict between Stalin and the old Bolsheviks, which culminated in the mass purges of the latter in the late 1930s. Part of this tension was cultural. As one of the few old Bolshevik elites who did not spend substantial time abroad, he only spent about 6 months abroad in Prague, Stalin often remarked on the gulf that separated him from former émigrés. He accused the émigrés of elitism, of clannishness, and of dilettantism at multiple junctures. But I think that Stalin also understood and feared the imaginative potential of immigration itself, especially as some of Stalin's one-time immigrant rivals, including Trotsky, fled abroad and reconstituted their international networks, now working to undermine Stalin's revolution. There was a real fear on Stalin's part that immigrant networks, which had once built an entirely new world abroad and effectively imported it back to Russia, would do so again. And this is the final and the most tragic irony of immigrant history, that the colonies' greatest accomplishments, their ability to transform abstract revolutionary visions into lived reality, also ultimately colluded in the destruction of their one-time residents. Thank you. I'm going to stop here and welcome any questions or comments people may have.
Hello. Well, thank you very much. I thought that was a great talk. That was so interesting in the way it kind of reconceptualized a lot of questions I think, you know, we in Russian history have been looking at for decades, but it's totally inverted them really. And it's given us something completely new to think about, loads of fresh ways of thinking about kind of long explored, but also kind of unexplored, it seems, questions. Very interesting, especially I think what happens with kind of Lenin and Stalin during and after 1917. I've never thought about it in that way, but it seems to make perfect sense. So I think that was a really brilliant talk. Thank you so much for doing that and for speaking to us at Parks. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions from the floor. So I suppose at this stage, then I'd like to invite anyone to maybe kind of like, maybe if they'd like to kind of like put their camera on and speak to us. I think there's enough time for like to generate a good discussion. If anyone's got any comments they'd rather put in the chat and they want me to read them out, that's fine. I'm happy to do that as well if you'd rather do that instead. So is anyone out there want to ask any questions?
Can I start, maybe?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, really fascinating. And in a way, a lot of what you've said sounds familiar, but I guess the emphasis makes it new. And I mean, what I want to ask basically is so I guess it's the question of, how do you say in English, the chicken and the egg, and what is, where is the origin? For example, you know, the turn to Yiddish propaganda. So I think it was very compelling what you said about the role of Lieberman and the Yiddish colony in London. But I wonder how it plays with the dynamics that were happening at the same time in the Pale of Settlement, and in particular in the north of the Pale of Settlement in Lithuania and Belarus at the time, were actually the same. So is it because, how can you demonstrate that it was the influence basically of the Yiddishists from London that led so many Bundists or pre-Bundists at the same time to come to the conclusion that Yiddish should be the language, for example, Żyklowski and many others in the early 90s?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, so you're of course absolutely right that the Northwest region, Vilna in particular, has its kind of own dynamics and its own history of Jewish radical activism and labor organization. But I think one of the things I was astonished as I did this research was to find at every turn, going back to the 1870s, how influenced that was by events abroad. And I guess I'll say the most surprising thing that I found about this, so there's very good labor histories written in the 70s and 80s about why Vilna. But I have another answer to why Vilna, and it turns out that Vilna was the major train juncture that all people and literature coming from the West passed through. And so Vilna was always the first city to get this illegal literature that was being smuggled into the Russian Empire by the thousands. And so we see accounts of this, and people talk about it all the time, of Vilna as always kind of on the vanguard because they're getting this stuff produced in the West. So you already see it in Vilna in the 1870s. So there's a socialist circle that forms. Aaron Lieberman is actually part of this in this rabbinical academy in Vilna in the 1870s, and they become very closely involved with this Lavrov circle, which is sort of like the premier Émigrés circle of this time period. And I mentioned as well in the talk, Lieberman's really important sort of like proto-Bundist activity and his first shift to Yiddish. But the other example that I'll give you is that even as you began to have these radical movements in the Northwest provinces by the 1880s, in part because of this literature coming in from overseas, the organizers in Vilna are still really struggling to bridge the divide between intellectuals who are speaking Russian, Jewish intellectuals who are speaking Russian and reading all of this revolutionary material in Russian, and the workers who are speaking Yiddish and are, of course, not really particularly interested in reading Russian Marxism. And you see that these Yiddish, these Russian Jewish Marxists who emerge in Vilna in the 1880s are actually very hesitant to use Yiddish. And in fact, their goal is to make Jewish workers stop speaking Yiddish and make them start speaking Russian, because they see that as a prerequisite to become a revolutionary. But again, it's the organizers abroad, and in particularly this Yiddish press coming from abroad and parties that have been organized from abroad that are instrumental in making this shift. So incidentally, the first movement in this direction doesn't come from sort of Lieberman's descendants. It actually comes from the PPS, the Polish Socialist Party, by that time very active in London and Paris, which is publishing in Yiddish abroad, trying to get Polish Jews to join its cause, and is really the first in Vilna to say, hey, you guys really need to learn Yiddish and think about workers and think about populism and stuff like this. And then these sort of proto-Bundists come in. So I think that, again, the availability of this literature from the West, but also just this, I think the real conceptual breakthrough that Lieberman had, that we can't just be having these highfalutin discussions about Marxism in Russian and mean anything to workers. His idea that we have to bring it to workers in the native language, and that actually it's not that we need to teach the workers, it's that the workers themselves, by virtue of their life experience, know and are sort of natural revolutionaries. I think that's the intellectual kernel of this new Yiddish populism that becomes really important in the Northwest provinces.
Thank you very much for that. That's brilliant. I wonder if, I think we've got another question. Anushka has written to me in the chat to ask a question. So Anushka, are you there? Hello?
Hi, yeah. I'm going to be really cheeky and ask two questions, because I have one that's personal and one that's academic.
Okay.
The personal one is that my great-grandfather was one of the Jewish Russian émigrés who came to the East End in the late 19th century. And apparently he was immensely proud of his Russian heritage, but also equally very Jewish. And I wondered how, like, what if you found anything that maybe talks about whether, like Russian Jewish emigres who came to London became more Russian or more Jewish once they were kind of released on the Pale of Settlement. They were released from like the legal restrictions of Russia. And then the second question is just about whether you did any work about the cadets, the constitutional democrats, especially when they were abroad in their kind of involvement in Europe.
Thank you. So I'll take the second question first. Yeah, I did not do work on the cadets or on other on liberals or on other reformist parties. Basically, I was focusing on these. There was always the question as I did this research of how I'm going to limit the immense scope of this project, and I ultimately decided to focus on these colonies themselves, which were overwhelmingly radical politically. And when cadets went abroad, there are really important stories to be told about really all elements of Russian life abroad, including incidentally conservatives. I mean, there's a lot to be said about Russian conservatives in Europe, but I sort of wasn't telling that story. And they have different, milieu that they frequent and different neighborhoods and different experiences and life stories. So there's a lot to be done there, but that was not what I did. In terms of sort of development of identities abroad, of course, it depends on the person, right? And I should also preface my comments by saying that many people come abroad and become very involved in these radical revolutionary movements and then become tired of it, either become disillusioned politically and believe the revolution's never going to happen, or they just become tired of all the squabbles and intrigue. Mark Mazauer has written, some people may be aware of his memoir, but he had his grandfather was a very prominent Bund activist who was active in the East End, and after the 1905 revolution just became tired and basically became a bourgeois gentleman in North London. And he has this lovely sort of historical reconstruction of his grandfather who never talked about this incredible revolutionary past. So he goes into the archives and reconstructs it, then is also thinking through kind of family trajectories and how people's paths can change. So without saying, it's hard to say what most people did, because also people like him, once they leave my colonies, they leave my story. And again, like as I said to your first question, I sort of stopped following them at this point. But I can say that in response to your family history, it certainly happened that people came to feel both more Russian and more Jewish abroad. I mean, I talked about these things in the archives. I just couldn't believe them when I found these, workers' meetings in the East End of these people in sweatshops saying, "I'm going to go back and die by assassinating the Tsar. That's going to solve my life and all of the problems I faced in Russia and all of the problems that I faced in immigration." Whereas you have the sense that, when these people were back home in Minsk or in Vilna, they really were not involved in Russian politics whatsoever, right? Like their life trajectory was just not doing that. So those accounts really astonished me. But what it means to be more Jewish, I think, is also a complicated question, and is one of the really interesting things I didn't get to talk about in the talk, but I talk about in great detail in the book. And I should say that when these Jewish proletarians began arriving, there's mass intervention by bourgeois Jews in London and Paris to help them, right? There are charitable efforts, but I would also say to assimilate them, to get them to comply to European norms, to get them to begin speaking French and English, to get them to abandon their traditional garb, things like this. And the tension that you see between these communities and the Jewish communities of London and Paris and earlier waves of immigration is really, really interesting. And again, there's people have told these stories through labor history and through police records, but there's actual physical violence that occurs. I mean, many of these revolutionaries will, for example, show up at the major synagogues on Yom Kippur in London, and they'll begin smoking and eating ham sandwiches, basically to show the rabbis what they think of their religion. And you have really, really intense confrontations around this. So I would say that the ways in which many become more Jewish is a very Russian radical Jewishness. It's not, and they're explicitly defining themselves against, let's say, assimilated bourgeois Jews. And this, by the way, also has something to do with the history of Zionism, where although, of course, there's a range of opinion of Zionists and a range of social backgrounds, one factor you see among many of these Russian Zionists is saying, we've decided we can't be real Jews, by which they mean sort of like the radical Eastern European Jew that I'm talking about in Europe. They're just trying to make us bourgeois citizens, and we need to have a lifestyle of our own elsewhere. So it's a complicated story, but there's definitely the element that you're talking about there.
Okay, thank you. I think does that help you, Anushka?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting. I'd never thought about it in that, with that kind of the tension with Jews who are already there and different communities.
Okay, all right, brilliant. Well, thank you so much for that really great answer. I think Claire definitely has more questions she wants to ask you, unless there's other people who want to, come forward. Like, anyone wants to say anything, obviously very welcome to sort of raise your hand on the Zoom, however you do that, or just write, if you want to write comments to me, a direct message, I'm happy to read them out. Faith, it's up to you, however you wish to do it. You might prefer not to speak on the thing, you might prefer to write a question, which is fine. So yeah, okay, right. Well, Claire.
George, it's Stephen Roman here.
Hello, Stephen.
I have a question I wouldn't mind to ask at some point.
Good.
Yeah.
Great. Would you like to go?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Faith. That was a really interesting discussion or introduction to the whole subject. I'm quite interested in the influence of the earlier generation of revolutionaries. Like, particularly, I'm thinking of the London colony in a sense, like Herzen and Kropotkin and others had on shaping the colonies in their early stages, and what were the sort of tensions that crept into the relationship? Because you've obviously described a later wave who came in the 1880s and 1890s, many of them with a sort of a stronger Jewish background and so forth. And you've indicated there were tensions between the sort of ethnic Russians, perhaps, and the sort of Jewish Russians. But what was the influence, or what was the relationship in say, somewhere like London with Herzen's thinking, Kropotkin's thinking on shaping those colonies, and how did it develop later on when the new wave came in?
Great, thank you for the question. So my book actually begins in the 1830s because, as you point out, that's the place where the story begins. You have to begin there. So I began with not only the generation of Herzen and Bakunin and all of them, but also the Polish Émigrés, which are important, who come in 1830 and 1863. And I guess in the book, I'm trying to trace both continuities and disjunctures. So I think certainly the theme of Utopia, migration, and Tom Stoppard has dealt with this theme better than anyone, right, in his plays. But thinking about life abroad as a laboratory and as a place in which to try new schemes to sort of renovate mankind, as Stoppard and others have shown, though with Utopia does often come these discontents. So you have, the debates within the community, but then also the disappointments of life abroad, that it's not the revolutionary hothouse that they wanted to see, that they're in Paris in 1848 and they see what happens and it's very distressing. They're in Paris in 1870 and they see what happened, or 1871 when the commune gets crushed, and they see all that. So I think that there's a continuity there. But I think what's really different about my story, and I'm sure you gathered in my analysis, I'm really stressing the emphasis. I'm really stressing space and communities.
Yeah.
And although there are moments, you always have the British Library as a locus, and these spaces in Geneva, these cafes in Geneva, where Herzen and friends will meet with exiled communal. Herzen dies in 1870, but some of the later Kropotkin and friends will meet with the exiled communal. But that earlier generation, I think their sense of community really focuses on a republic of letters. They are constantly in motion. And even when Herzen is in London, I think he lives in like 26 addresses in London. He moves every few months. Often to vary, and he tends to live on the periphery. So it's not even like there is a neighborhood that he lives in, but moves around a lot. He's just constantly everywhere. So I think about this first generation as a republic of letters, and that's the way that they're interacting with each other and sort of dreaming and fighting. And I think about these later generations as an actual embedded community that has this sort of like urban setting. And although I think the dreams and the disenchantments continue, I think that when these dreams and debates are taking place in a cafe or a library or a dance hall, it's a little different than when they're taking place through an epistolary culture. So that's how I treat that early history.
Thank you. No, that's very clear. Very interesting indeed, actually, that distinction you're making. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you so much for that question. And we've got a comment here from Bernice Heilbrunn. This is a brilliant conversation. Thanks very much. So people are really enjoying it. I can see there's also a comment in the chat, but maybe I'll come to Adrian Lovrich, who's got his hand up. Hello. I think you're muted.
Okay, right. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, Faith. That was amazing. And I'm very much looking forward to reading the book. My particular interest is, in fact, in radical Jews in South Africa in the 20th century. Okay. So I'm very interested. This, in a sense, actually is the story in a sense before that.
Yeah.
I've got lots of questions, but I'm particularly interested. I guess my question is around why you've kind of framed this 1830 to 1930. You have to start somewhere and stop somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm just wondering why you particularly, was there something particular about 1930? I guess, I mean, obviously there's Stalin is in full control by this point in Russia, which may have had an impact.
Yeah. So it's 1830s to 1930s. So the stopping point's not 1930, but it's a good question. So I started in the 1830s because 1830 revolution in Paris, which has a huge impact on events in Poland, and then begins this whole phenomenon of immigration. But it goes to the 1930s because this is basically it's the lifespan, right? Almost all of these original revolutionaries who go back to Russia die in the Great Purchase. These are the oldest of the old Bolsheviks. So, even Stalin is referred to as an old Bolshevik, but he joins the party, around 1905, and there are people who were there in Geneva in 1903. And those that are still alive at that point die in the 1930s at Stalin's hands. And so I saw that as the natural endpoint, not only because it's the end of their natural life and kind of their dreams for revolution and their aspirations, but also I alluded to kind of the tension between Stalin and the Émigrés in the talk, but allow me to say a little more about it because it was a little bit truncated for the purposes of time. So I argue in the book that as I suggested, with Lenin's arrival, the colonies are fairly dysfunctional places in the early 20th century, and people are already losing hope that they can accomplish what they had dreamed. And a lot of émigrés in Russia who had previously, I have one quote from I think the 1890s of one young Russian talking about Paris and Geneva as, quote, the Mecca and Medina of Russian revolutionary culture. They had really seen this as the place to be, the place to go, the place everything happens. By the period after the 1905 revolution, that's really changing. And in fact, I have a quote already in 1911. Stalin is very skeptical. And he says, basically, I'm a practical worker. You guys are sitting in Paris and London drinking coffee. I'm in a czarist prison. You're enjoying yourself. And this tension really continues throughout between these self-proclaimed practical workers and these immigrant intellectuals. So there's further evidence in the 1920s when the Society of Old Bolsheviks is founded. This is founded by the cohort that was very close to Lenin and immigration. Stalin comes to the first meeting in 1922 and tells them they're trying to preserve their privilege. So again, there's this kind of like anti-intellectual, anti-immigrant thing. And the most compelling evidence I found was a 1931 interview with Stalin where a German journalist asks him point blank, he says, you were one of the few émigrés that did not live for years abroad, one of the few old Bolsheviks. Does that put you at a disadvantage? And he says again, no, I was in tsarist prison fighting the regime. And these guys were, drinking beer in Berlin. That's what he says. So his sort of distaste for them, for their style, and I think as I'm arguing the talk, also his fear of their connections is palpable. So I think the 1930s makes sense as an endpoint, not only because this is the natural death of those who stay in Russia, but also because I'm arguing that, I'm not arguing that immigration caused the purges, that would be far too sloppy, but certainly I think that in asking sort of what was Stalin's problem with the old Bolsheviks, which many historians have addressed in different ways, I think that this helps to explain something new about the dynamics of that moment and about what he feared, given that as I also said in the talk, all his opponents, Bukharin, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, all of them were émigrés, and all of them did have all of these connections abroad that they were leveraging. Trotsky, right, is explicitly going back to the guys he knew in Europe in the 19-teens and trying to create revolution. So I think Stalin was right to be afraid of them, I argue.
Good. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. Another great question. So there's a few questions that have come in the chat as comments. I'll just pick a few of these up now. So this one's from Patricia Davis. You referenced their influence on other burgeoning revolutionary movements. Could you elaborate a little on this, especially regarding the Irish connection? Thank you for the brilliant talk.
Yeah, the Irish connection is fascinating. So it first appears in the 1880s. Of course, circa 1880 is when there's a spate of bombings in England, and things get very difficult for Irish nationalists, and many of them go into exile. Many of them go into exile in Paris, where they meet these Russians. So Kropotkin, the anarchist activist, is in very close contact with Irish nationalists in the 1880s. But one of the most interesting things I found while doing the project was that this Irish-Russian connection also finds its way, it's not only political, it also finds its way into sort of literary polemics and just cultural life in general. So the example that I'll give you is Oscar Wilde's first play is called Vilna or the Nihilists. It's a terrible play, but it's about a Russian revolutionary obviously modeled on Vera Zasulich, although kind of loosely. And it's about the romantic, glorious life of these Russian nihilists. And you find this all over Irish literature. They're really, really interested in Russians in the 1880s and 90s. And a number of literary scholars have said that this is basically because it was so difficult to discuss the Irish situation in England in this period, that Russia becomes a sort of Aesopic way of discussing empire and discussing oppression and discussing colonialism. And so these Irish activists just, they can denounce the Tsarist regime until the cows come home and it's fine. And actually, the British government agrees, but they can't say the same thing about the fate of the Irish. So there's this long strand in Irish literature of fascination with Russians in this period that's really fascinating.
Great. Okay, thank you very much for that question. Here's another one. This is from Hannah Connell. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I'd be interested to know what echoes, changes, or continuities in radical social and political thought and practice you may have come across between the pre-revolutionary émigré colonies you explore and later Russian émigré communities in Europe from 1918 on.
Yeah. So there's a huge literature on the immigration post 1918, right, which is even more complex, even larger, and even more sociologically diverse than mine that I'm talking about. So I deal with this a little bit in the epilogue, but I did not follow the story, for example, of the white immigration, the liberals who leave, the priests and clerics and their families who leave, the counter-revolutionaries who leave, again, simply because this is ancillary to my story. I mean, on the one hand, I think they pull on there are certain emotional elements, like the desire to build new futures abroad. In some cases, although I'm trying to think, in some cases, they move into, there are areas of North London where there had been some revolutionaries prior to the Russian Revolution that some of these newcomers come to. But in general, there's not a lot of continuity just because the ideology is so different, the demographics are so different, et cetera. The post-revolutionary immigration that is very important to my book is what happens to those émigrés who, as I said, basically most people who can come back to Russia in 1917, but very quickly things go badly for the opponents of the Bolsheviks, the Bundists, the anarchists, the Mensheviks, et cetera, who will not join. Some join the Bolshevik Party, but those who don't are basically given the choice to be imprisoned or exiled in Russia or to go back into foreign exile. And so here the case of these former immigrant communities, that the connections are much more significant. And in many cases, the case I'll give you is the Mensheviks, who prior to 1917 saw themselves as sort of the the most European, the most cosmopolitan element of the Russian immigration. They had very, very close connections with the German Social Democratic Party. And when they're forced to flee abroad in 1921-22, they all go to Berlin, and they all just immediately pick up these old friendships, connections that they've had for decades. And this really helps them actually as they're trying to essentially get the German Social Democrats to turn against the Bolsheviks and to sort of become anti-communist. So there are elements where that post-revolutionary period is very important to my story. But again, there's so many stories to be told about immigration, and I can't do them. I can't do them all. But it's still a topic that I think deserves a lot of further research, although there's been a fair amount done on the white immigration post-1917.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. Very, really detailed, and thank you very much for your question. Hannah says thank you. Very grateful for their answer. So thank you very much for that, Faith. I know Claire actually, I think had another question, and Claire's been really patient. So maybe at this point,
Not
Claire
at
can
all.
come in. Yeah, and then I'll read out one more afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Actually, my question was on the question that was just asked, and more specifically, I would like to know if you have worked on Berlin and on Berlin after the revolution, because what I have myself discovered a little bit in my research on the Belarusian and Jewish and Russian and Lithuanian émigrés milieu in 1918, 1920, 21 is that this sense of utopia and, of colonies where people mix and where there is no clear subnational groups, as in the early period that you've described, actually maybe restarts in Berlin at this period. So I wondered if it's something that you've come across, or maybe it's beyond what you've researched.
Yeah, it was a bit beyond. I didn't have the time or the word count or anything to get into the really interesting story of Berlin. But I think that you're right, that there are, I think the way I would put it is there are, I mean, certainly the story is still very based around neighborhoods, and certain neighborhoods are associated with certain communities. I didn't really get into it deeply for the book, but I know that I once read there's a very short piece that Nabokov wrote about growing up in Berlin that I remember being very evocative about the neighborhoods, and I think he grew up in Charlottenburg. But anyway, there's a lot to be said about that. I'm a little surprised in the literature. Like, I don't think anyone has quite taken on for the post-1917 immigration this question of neighborhood organization in the spirit that I have for this period. Although I was, as I said, not able to do that for the later period, I do think someone should do that. Carl Schlegel also has this huge, really great book about Russian immigrants in Berlin, but I don't recall it being based on neighborhood. Catherine Gusev may be working on something like that. But anyway, super rich terrain and much more to be said than I can say, I guess.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. So I'm going to come to another comment in the chat. It's quite a long one, and I'm really sorry if I mispronounce anything in it, by the way. So it's from Lisha Camille. Fantastic talk and research, thank you. Could Faith talk further about the Russian Zionists, both in the colonies and also those who ended up in Palestine trying to create a utopian society, utopian in scare quotes, incidentally, the different Aliot, ALIYOT. Also, the influence on the creation of socialist kibbutz culture, different Kutzvot, Rosh Pina, Degania, Kinneret, etc. I'm really sorry if I mispronounced any of those, by the way, Lisha. Thinking of the impact on ideas literature, A.D. Gordon, for example, and values of many of those arriving to the swamp terrain. Is Palestine of the 1860, 1880s, 1906, 1920s, etc., considered another colony in inverted commas again, in terms of ideas? Obviously, not a proper colony in size. All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, really, really interesting question. Again, this is where, as I suggested, there's really a story to be told here, and elements have been told. It was not in my purview. I don't speak Hebrew, so someone with Hebrew needs to do that. But yes, from what I know, I say absolutely. I mean, if we're talking vaguely about the idea of utopia, there's obviously a connection to Zionism from the beginning. And I should also say Russian Zionism is such a complicated thing to talk about because there's so many varieties of it. And it's, I mean, I often in the talk used it as a counterpoint to Marxism because often it turns into a debate between Marxism and nationalism. But in fact, as I'm sure you know, there were also really prominent Zionist Marxists, many of whom were active in the colonies and then were sort of like using the debates that they had when they moved to Palestine to produce kibbutzes and things like this. So there's absolutely a genealogical connection. So I think that in the earlier period, the idea of utopia is important to Zionists. And by the time we get to the later period that you're talking about, there's an actual demonstrable connection to my story in that I said that by about 1906, as the colonies are breaking down, as people have realized the revolution is not going to happen imminently in Russia because of the experience in 1905, many of these Zionists in the colonies become disillusioned and move on to Palestine. I think the person who's dealt with this the best, it's a very old book, but it's still an excellent book, is Jonathan Frankel's Prophecy and Politics. And he talks in great detail about how the kind of like utopian and messianic impulses in many of these kibbutz projects and many of these Zionist projects were intimately connected to radical culture in Russia and also radical culture in immigration. But again, I think that there's new work to be done in this vein as well. That's a book from 1981, so it has to be updated.
Okay, right. Thank you so much for that answer, and thank you for the great question. I wonder, oh, I can see there's a new message. Lisha says, thank you so much. So she's very grateful for the response. Thank you so much for your question as well, Lisha. I thought that's really, really interesting. Really sorry if I got any of it wrong or mangled it. I think that was a great question. So Roman says, a fascinating talk and excellent discussion. Many thanks, I have learned a lot. Thank you very much. I just wonder, because we're coming up to time, if there are any other kind of final questions or comments anyone's got? Anyone out there would like to interject? There's still a little bit of time if anyone would like to come forward and ask a question. Well, maybe it's time then to wrap up, and thank Faith very much for coming. I think that was a really brilliant talk. I mean, I study Russia and I've done now for a long time, and you know, I think intellectual history has kind of been something that I think it's fair to say has not been incredibly fashionable for several decades, but that's really actually, I think, inverted the way we can actually think about doing intellectual history and thinking about space and community, as well as the kind of the, as you say, the Republic of Letters. I think it's a really interesting, really exciting new way of thinking about the field, and it asks all sorts of transnational questions, which are really important, and I think that's shown by the discussion it's generated, which is incredibly wide-ranging. So yeah, I'm certainly looking forward to reading it, and I'm sure a lot of people who've attended today are going to enjoy reading this book as well. And
thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
No, that was great. If anyone's interested in upcoming Parks events, Claire's posted a link in the chat, and you can see this if you want to visit southampton.ac.uk. You can see our new events coming up. And yeah, I thought that was a great talk, and thank you very much for the people who asked some fascinating questions as well.